A story rewritten in the diary of an old man recounts the first time a stranger came to the village. Initially, old man did not have a good impression of the stranger. Looking into the eyes of the man who just entered the village, those eyes seemed to have seen many terrible things. The villager thinks it would be pleasant if the man did not stay in the village. However, because the current village chief is kind-hearted, he allows the young man with the sword to stay in the village. As usual, the villager ignores this and continues with his farming work. 4 days have passed since the young man arrived in their village. The place where he lives is quite quiet, as if no one is living there. A week later, and 10 days since he first appeared in the village, the old man learns through the children that the man spends all day practicing his sword swings. The old man thinks there must be something troubling the man, deciding it's best not to pay any attention. A month goes by, and the man continues to practice sword swings in his house. Another month passes in the same way, with the man continually practicing with his sword. The villagers say he is preparing to take revenge on someone. There are rumors that he deeply dislikes knights and renowned mercenaries. The old man has no interest in those rumors, but one day he decides to go and watch the man practice. The man has been training for nearly half a year without taking a day off. By then, the curiosity of the villager, who is also a young man in the village, grows too large to ignore, despite trying not to care. He wonders whether the man might become a great swordsman. Finally, he decides that he will go and watch the next day. However, what he finds is only disappointment. To those who know nothing about swords, it might look impressive. But to him, who can easily judge through the awkward movements and having dealings with a few swordsmen in his business, he knows the man is nothing special. At this point, the old man feels a sense of sympathy rise within him. There must be some hidden meaning behind the man, a story that causes him both physical and mental pain. He decides it's best not to concern himself with the man's issues anymore and leaves. After some time, another family comes to the village. A retired mercenary arrives with his daughter and son. The daughter, named Rima, is extremely beautiful. The young man, who is also our old man in the future, is instantly drawn to her, and she eventually becomes his wife. 3 years pass, and the man continues to practice his swordsmanship nonstop. This odd persistence compels the young man to, for the first time in his life, start writing down the events occurring in the village. After 2 years of courtship, Rima becomes his wife, the most precious thing he has ever acquired. Strangely, over the next 5 years, he still can't stop thinking about the swordsman. 5 years is a long time, filled with many interesting and tempting things outside, yet the man just stands in front of his house, continuously swinging his sword. The old man wonders how long he intends to do this and keeps observing his house. When his first daughter, Laura, is born and the swordsman has been practicing for over 7 years, the old man decides after 15 years to stop the pointless task of recording these events. Life goes on until his old age. When watching his daughter and his young grandson playing in the yard on a beautiful day, he feels the urge to go outside for a walk. It's been a long while and everything in the village has changed except for the swordsman's house. He heads toward that house, calculating that 37 years have passed. Before him, he now sees the image of an old man who, even in death, still holds his sword. Those eyes still blaze with passion until the very last moment, never letting go of the sword. He can't look into those eyes for long until the glow slowly fades. The old man hopes the young man has reached a better place in the next world. Irene wakes up from the dream, panicking and wondering what kind of dream was that. He lives in Pereira Spiritual District in the south of the Kingdom of Hale, a place with many slaves from neighboring kingdoms. And one thing stands out more than others, namely the children of the Pereira Baron family. First, it is necessary to mention Princess Cairo, who is only 11 years old but has already received the title of sorceress. Another equally famous person is Irene Pereira, nicknamed the Lazy Noble. Irene lost his mother at a very young age and did nothing until the age of 15. He spent his days only in his room doing nothing but sleeping, which is how he earned his nickname. Although Emilia, Carl's mother, is only a second wife, since they came to this house, the future has been much brighter for them. Both of them are truly special compared to others. They always give their love to Irene despite the harsh words said about him by outsiders. Irene's life has never been the same since that bizarre dream. He could feel the taste of sweat when he was tired. The screams from his muscles, all of it felt so real. And above all, Irene's body felt the absence of something he couldn't control. Irene calls his servant outside to bring him a sword, a request that makes the servant incredibly surprised, widening his eyes at his master. Not just the close servant, but everyone in the mansion is shocked when Irene goes to the training yard by himself. Indeed, a rare occasion, as it was already difficult to see Irene on a normal day, let alone now going to the training ground. The servant next to Irene explains that even though they are wooden swords, they function differently depending on their shape and length. He is not a skilled swordsman, so he wants to find someone knowledgeable to teach the young master. Irene says it's okay, he's fine. He then goes to pick a sword by himself. Following the habit in his dream, Irene picks the largest sword. For the first time holding a sword in real life, it wasn't as easy as he thought. The soldiers behind chatter as they see Irene struggling to lift the wooden sword. They think he is terrible. Irene is a lazy person who does nothing because he sleeps all day, but seeing him trying for the first time shocks everyone. A rumor spreads that Irene is practicing swordsmanship because Yeonju from the neighboring country insulted his ducal title. The soldiers bet among themselves that Irene won't have the patience to practice swordsmanship for more than 3 days. Irene's servant next to him silently curses the fools, noting everyone is different. He then tells Irene that the art of swordsmanship requires relentless effort, and it would be hard for him alone to overcome the hardship. He wants to call someone to guide and help the young master. Irene, however, pays no attention to what the person beside him is saying. He is immersed in his own world. Irene feels that each time he wields the sword, not only do his hands ache, but the muscles throughout his body feel as if they are splitting. Yet, it brings Irene an immense sense of tranquility. The more he repeats the motions from his dream, the more he seems to shed the heavy feelings in his heart. Each sword swing dispels all the bad memories and confused thoughts, making it impossible for Irene to stop. The servant beside him, Worry, comes to stop Irene's motions, reminding him that it has already gotten dark. Irene, unaware, looks up to see the setting sky, not realizing how quickly time has passed. Thus, for several days in a row, Irene diligently practices at the training ground. The strange dream continues to haunt him since then. To ease his discomfort, Irene can only continue to practice diligently with the sword. On the 4th day, while the soldiers are still betting on who will win, an old man asks them for directions to the training ground. He introduces himself as a wanderer who wishes to see the training ground as someone who has wielded a sword before. The soldiers lead the old man to the training ground, their eyes widening in astonishment at the sight of the person on the ground. They are convinced that Irene must be out of his mind. The old man watches intently as Irene swings the sword and thinks not bad. He doesn't feel it's a waste of time coming here. However, Irene's swordsmanship is still very immature. Irene is too frail and can barely withstand the weight of the sword. Just by looking, the old man can tell Irene is using all his energy. He just wants to know how long Irene will keep practicing. Is it true as rumor that he is only practicing because of Yeonju? As everyone present at the training ground feels a breeze, Kurl, along with a mythical creature, Griffin, lands on the ground. The Griffin is described as having the body of a tiger and the head of an eagle, with skin as hard as steel. People believe it to be a mythical creature that does not exist in reality. Kurl's magical ability is to control what she creates, infusing them with energy to make them seem alive. Kurl reminds the soldiers who spoke ill of her brother that they are still on duty, questioning why they are loitering and neglecting their tasks. She loudly points out that their gossiping during training time is already a breach of discipline. Irene approaches to ask what the matter is, and Kurl bluntly tells her brother to give up right now. She questions what he thinks he is doing and urges him to stop his foolish actions. Irene, frustrated, turns away to return to the sword training ground. Kurl yells from outside, questioning if her brother thinks sword training is so easy. She points out that even at his age, he is still sleeping all day, and even now, his swordsmanship hasn't improved. She indicates a new soldier nearby, stating he is doing much better than her brother. Her sister wants to confirm if Irene is acting this way because of a past insult. Then Amelia appears, telling her daughter not to bother her brother anymore. She gently reminds Irene not to overexert himself and leads her daughter away. An old man smiles and whispers, wondering if this is the famous Kurl, like a storm passing by. He then focuses on Irene, noting that despite everything, his mind remains unshaken. He decides to stay a few days longer to observe. That evening, Kurl goes to Irene's room, but he has already fallen asleep after a tiring day of training. Despite being stopped by her brother's servant, Kurl stubbornly leaves a bag of items in her brother's room. She warns the servant not to tell anyone about today, or he will face the consequences. The next morning, Irene wakes up to find a letter from his sister on his bed. She apologizes for her harsh words and expresses her genuine concern for him. Kurl also leaves a doll to assist Irene with his work. At the end of the letter, she asks her brother not to tell their mother about her visit, as their mother had instructed not to disturb him. Behind her sister's letter, there is another from Amelia, simply stating that if Kurl bothers him, he should tell her. Amelia plans to pretend she is unaware of the letter until then. After reading both letters, Irene smiles, acknowledging that his mother and sister care deeply for him. However, he reflects on how for the past 10 years he has only been lazy, acting foolishly. When the servant brings breakfast to Irene's room, but he declines it, stating that from now on he will often eat with everyone else. The servant can't help but smile, realizing the young master has really changed. During the meal, Kurl keeps adding food to Irene's bowl. Irene pauses his eating to thank everyone, expressing gratitude for the family's care despite his idleness all day. He apologizes for causing them worry. Irene's father laughs heartily and tells him to continue eating, mentioning that he has heard about his recent dedication to sword training. He praises Irene for his enthusiasm, but advises not to overexert himself. Irene assures him he is fine, thinking to himself that compared to what he has practiced in his dreams, this is nothing. 15 days pass, and Irene trains relentlessly. The old man continues to stay near the training ground to observe Irene. Today, he wonders if it has been 10 days since his arrival. Initially, he thought Irene was training out of ego and insecurity and would soon give up, but he was completely wrong. The old man had heard that Irene was so lazy that lazy became his nickname. However, Irene, who had never practiced swordsmanship before, manages to train for many days without showing any signs of discouragement. The old man now considers Irene's mind like that of a steelworker, enduring day by day without being shaken. Even in his lifetime, he had never encountered anyone like that. No matter how strong a hero is, they need to train for a long time to develop such a steely will. He is surprised to see it in a 15-year-old boy. He knows that if Irene is guided by a dedicated teacher, he could go very far. The old man approaches the gatekeeper Yangbin to ask if the young noble will receive sword training. Yangbin laughs heartily and replies that the Lord has said he would teach the boy how to use a sword. But currently, Irene is practicing on his own without any teacher. The old man continues to inquire if he knows who will be the instructor. Yangbin strokes his chin, revealing that it's no secret that the knight Orange Yukra might be the instructor. Upon hearing this name, the old man vehemently objects, insisting he will not let a precious gem fall into the hands of a man known only for shouting at soldiers. He decides to act immediately to prevent wasting such talent. He approaches the Lord to deliver a letter of introduction to the Chrono Swordsmanship Academy, the best swordsmanship school on the continent that accepts only true talents regardless of race, gender, or status. Being a student there is akin to being treated as a noble. Its reputation even surpasses that of the Royal Academy. However, gaining admission and surviving in the academy are incredibly challenging. The Lord worries whether his son can withstand such relentless competition. He discusses the letter with his son to let Irene decide for himself. He won't pressure him. If Irene wishes, he can decline. Irene asks his father for more time to think, as he still doubts his abilities, having done nothing but lie down for the past 10 years. Yet now, Irene does not want to remain idle any longer for himself and his family. Immediately after, Irene runs to inform his father that he will go, marking the first time he leaves home alone. On the way, the servant takes out a necklace shaped like a sword from his coat, a gift Carl prepared for her brother. The servant offers to escort Irene to the school's gate, but he declines, stating that from now on, he is just a student and will start doing things on his own. The servant bows and wishes the young master success in bringing honor back home. Joining Irene at the academy is Bart Lloyd from the distinguished Lloyd family of the Kubra Kingdom, introduced by the renowned knight Colsway. Unlike Bart, who receives considerable attention, Irene quietly approaches the gate to present an introduction letter from Bran Somerville, a wandering knight. Karaka, greeting them with a smile, recognizes the young master from the Pereira family and knows Bran Somerville, who led the mining conquest for decades. Karaka asserts that if Irene is recommended by him, he will surely pass the test. A person standing beside Karaka expresses surprise, questioning if the old man really wrote the letter of introduction. In the academy, Irene is visibly weak, living up to his nickname of lazy, leading many to wonder what the old man saw in him to write a letter of introduction. Karka responds that they will soon find out. As Irene pushes through the doors into the waiting hall, all eyes are on him. He continually reassures himself to stay calm. The instructor addresses the 400 probationary students, announcing that he will be assessing them. Scanning the crowd, he recognizes several promising faces, notably Ilya Lindsay, the second prodigy from the Lindsay family. The instructor reminds the students that they are not yet official, but merely probationary. As everyone is aware, the swordsmanship training process is extremely challenging. Those who pass the next capability assessment will spend a year training here. Until then, everyone remains a probationary student, and hardships await even when they become official students. He instructs everyone to leave their belongings and head outside to start training, emphasizing that physical training involves conditioning both cardiorespiratory stamina and muscular endurance. Then, with a loud shout, he leads the first assessment run. Bart decides to hang back to observe the situation. He notices Irene struggling on the ground. Bart silently scoffs at Irene's lazy nickname, seeing it as quite fitting. At that moment, Irene feels like his heart might burst from the effort. Unable to bear the feeling of everyone running ahead while he can barely lift his legs, Irene summons all of his remaining strength to continue running. He knows this is nothing compared to the man in his dreams. Irene wants to be like that man, to stand on equal footing with him. Motivated by this desire, Irene pushes himself to keep running, determined not to be lazy anymore. Karaka stood outside observing the situation and felt extremely amazed by the trainee Irene. He initially thought Irene would give up immediately, but surprisingly, Irene stood up again and ran after everyone. However, it was evident that Irene was not in good condition. As Karaka had predicted, just as Irene approached, he fainted. Irene was completely exhausted after pushing beyond his physical limits. Karaka smiled, finding Irene a fascinating child. When Irene woke up again, he was in a room. Runtarhal, seeing him awake, laughed loudly and assured that there was no need to worry as his body was completely fine, being the person in charge of the recuperation room. Irene thanked Runtarhal for his help, to which he continued to laugh, saying that thanks were certainly due. Without his skills, Irene would not have recovered so quickly. Run Tarhal patted Irene on the back, suggesting that they would likely see each other often from now on. Irene, feeling shy, responded that it seemed likely. Then Run Tarhal showed Irene the leaderboard of the competition. Knowing his results were not good, he reassured there was no need to worry. It was different from the midterm and final evaluations that affected official enrollment. This was merely a quick test to determine the capabilities of the reserve trainees. Seeing his rank at the bottom, Irene did not show a strong reaction. Run Tarhal, worried that Irene might get discouraged, continually motivated him. After all, the scores would be completely different after a year, so there was no need to worry. Irene responded softly, surprising him. He did not seem sad at all, resembling the interesting person he had heard Irene was described as. Run Tarhal did not say much more and sent Irene out of the room, not allowing him to hang around on his first day. Lunch break ended and Karaka began the class. He was the main instructor for this group of reserve trainees. He informed everyone that from now on, all daily activities would be practiced according to a preset schedule. If there were any changes, notifications would follow. Aside from daily activities, there was free time. Starting today, the drill hall, indoor training room, and various training areas would be open all night. Thus, if any reserve trainees wanted to practice individually, they were free to use these facilities. Irene thought to himself, great, he could practice swordsmanship there. Karaka, as if reading everyone's thoughts, continued to announce that the use of all types of weapons during training was strictly prohibited. Two followers behind Bart loudly complained that the free arts class was too boring, and the thought of theory made them feel sleepy. Three people entered the training room and discovered that everyone was diligently practicing on the first day. Bart glanced at Alia, who was the most outstanding person in the room, and thought to himself that all the rumors about her were wrong. Just looking at her overwhelmed Bart, she did not seem like a reserve trainee at all. She made Bart feel inferior. The two people with Bart then approached Irene and were surprised to see him also practicing diligently. They laughed loudly, commenting on how different he was, which was indeed ridiculous. If he had been this diligent, why had he been lazy for the past 15 years? Ilya, hearing the mocking laughter, took notice. At this point, Bart decided to lead the other two away, stating it was pointless to waste time on trivial matters. On their way out of the training room, Bart looked at Judith, who had defeated him and secured the second position in the test. She was just an ordinary person, but being there meant she must be very strong. Bart silently vowed not to let himself lose to her. Judith, annoyed, turned back to Bart and yelled not to stare like that, as it was distracting. The two accompanying Bart stepped forward and asked her what she had just said, reminding her that Bart came from a noble family and deserved respect. They demanded that Judith kneel and apologize, but she ignored them. She retorted that if everyone ate the same food, why did some have such foul mouths? Bart angrily told her to shut up. Meanwhile, Alita approached Irene, asking if they could talk for a moment. Both Ilya and Judith paid attention as they walked away. When Irene returned, Judith, unable to contain her curiosity, approached him. She irritably said she had no interest in him and quickly asked him to tell her what Ilya had said. Judith was surprised to learn that Ilya had simply been teaching Irene how to properly use the equipment in the training room. Of course, she did not believe it. Judith further inquired about their relationship, asking if they had known each other before. Irene honestly answered that it was their first time meeting. Judith, unsatisfied, walked away, not before telling Irene to drop the innocent look so no one would say he was being bullied. Putting this aside, Irene returned to practicing diligently as Ilya had taught. But before he could start, the next person approached. Bart came over, saying he wanted to know what Irene and Ilya had discussed, and if possible, the conversation between him and Judith as well. As the month passed, they repeated the training routine. Some felt it was absurd not to be able to use their own swords. During this time, Ilya continued to help Irene with his training. Gradually, Bart stopped paying attention to their activities, realizing that he could not win against Ilya if he remained calm. However, unlike her, Bart was convinced that Irene must have received some kind of help to get where he was. Bart looked down on someone who had never trained and could not possibly reach his level. All those efforts seemed futile to him. Although the mockery from others and Ilya's encouragement might boost Irene's spirits, Bart believed that once Irene got used to it, he would revert to his old ways, returning to being a lazy noble. Bart's current goal was the second position. Therefore, he left the training room with his two friends to go to the running track. Not just them, but Judith had arrived there earlier, which annoyed Bart. Someone next to him loudly said that a person like her needed to train much harder than normal to stay here. 3 months later, Karaka was very pleased with everyone, as they were still striving hard in their training. There were quite a few promising elements this year. Just as he had predicted, the 3 unmatched trainees continued practicing in their own ways. And even the so-called lazy noble, Irene, could not be called lazy anymore. He had been truly diligent in his training lately. It was almost time for the midterm evaluation, which included 4 courses that everyone needed to complete within a limited time. People whispered in disbelief about how they could possibly complete it in the allotted time. The instructor responded that it was not difficult at all. The courses included everything they had learned over the past 4 months, including running and swimming. He added that this test was just a capability evaluation and everyone just needed to complete the course within the set time. Rankings were not important. A piece of information that surely every trainee wanted to hear was that the Sword Master would personally reward the top 5 reserve trainees. The test would take place in 10 more days, during which there would be no classes. Everyone was to use the free time, excluding meal times. Bart quietly assessed Ilya, Judith, and the others, planning his strategy. With the goal of making it into the top 5, Bart saw no risk for himself. However, surprisingly, Bart was paying close attention to Irene. During today's training session, Judith discovered that Irene was continuing to train beyond his physical limits. It was clear that Irene's physical condition had improved significantly compared to when he first joined the academy. Judith wondered how Irene could still continue. She couldn't allow herself to be outdone by someone who had once been rumored to be lazy. Judith could not accept that and returned to her training even more determined. Today, the Swordmaster was also present in the training room, preferring to see things for himself rather than just hear about them from others. First, Ian greeted Karaka, the new instructor. Karaka was honored to meet the Swordmaster. The old man laughed loudly and asked Karaka how old he thought he was. Karaka quickly guessed an age that was only half of the old man's true age, which made him laugh and decide to increase Karaka's salary. Another instructor standing nearby whispered not to believe him, as the financial manager was someone else. The Swordmaster observed the training room and seemed quite satisfied with the new trainees. His gaze shifted to Ilya, who was training. Karaka stepped forward and introduced her as the girl from the Lindsay family, known for their swordsmanship tradition. Indeed, she was a prodigy. Ilya had never lost the first position in any test. Truly a prodigy worthy of her reputation. Ian whispered, feeling sorry for her. The girl could choose her own path, but she was obsessed with walking the same road as everyone else. The old man hoped Ilya could let go of those persistent feelings. Ian then turned his attention to Judith and asked the instructor if she was the girl he had previously mentioned. Ian immediately noticed that she was overexerting herself. He asked Karaka if he had tried to stop her. Karaka responded that he had, of course, but she wouldn't listen. Judith was one of the most stubborn among the trainees. Ian felt it was a great waste if Judith continued to train until she collapsed. The Swordmaster approached Judith himself to find out why. The two instructors stayed back, speculating whether the Swordmaster could persuade her. When he returned, he had to admit that Judith was indeed very stubborn. She said she wouldn't stop until he found a reasonable reason for her to do so. Ian suddenly remembered Irene and continued to inquire about him. On the other side, Irene continued to train for 30 minutes without any signs of wanting to stop. Contrary to previous times, this time the Swordmaster instructed the trainers to leave him be, whispering that as long as the boy does not give up, he should never be stopped. The night before the test began, Irene did not sleep and practice all night, which made Bart's group scoff. The two people with Bart kept laughing, calling Irene a fool. Bart remained silent, calculating that Judith had also been training very hard recently. Her condition was probably even worse than before. Bart was pleased, thinking the second position this time was definitely his. Karaka once again briefed about the evaluation. There would be 4 stages in this course, each managed by an instructor. Once participants surpassed the set point, they could move to the next. Karaka reminded everyone that this test was an absolute evaluation. Therefore, they should not let the surroundings affect them and show everyone their progress. Ilya completed the first stage with incredible speed. Bart thought he could never achieve such speed no matter how much he trained. But apart from Ilya, Bart thought he would not let anyone else beat him. He was again surprised by Irene's speed, wondering how the kid could do it. Was he trying to exhaust himself to death? After Ilya, the first person to pass the first stage was Irene. Everyone was baffled by what just happened. Irene ignored the mockery and moved forward, even surprising himself. His body felt intensely hot, not like the usual overexertion. He refused to allow thoughts of exhaustion to enter his mind and wanted to push even further. While everyone else was still at stage 1, Irene continued and passed through stage 2. While Irene thought about surpassing Ilya, Judith ran past him. Judith ran forward, thinking she would not lose, she would never lose. She had overcome countless difficulties to get here. She shouted that she would never lose and then jumped into the swimming pool to start stage 4. Judith knew she was overexerting herself, but she still held the thought that without pushing beyond limits, how could she beat anyone? Judith wanted to keep trying, but her body gradually sank into the water. Irene, who was chasing behind, saw this and quickly moved to pull Judith to safety. His test was thereby surpassed by others as he focused on rescuing her. Judith excitedly asked Irene what she was doing. Irene reassured her, telling her not to worry as they would soon reach the shore. Upon reaching the shore, they saw Karaka, who had also arrived, and urged Irene to continue with the test and leave the rest to him. Before fainting, Judith only managed to scold someone as a fool. Setting this incident aside, the exam proceeded very smoothly. The two instructors laughed heartily as they had predicted that there would be more successful candidates in the first round of evaluation than the previous year. Karaka added that this year definitely felt different. There were many talented children, but Irene stood out the most in this midterm evaluation. Karaka highlighted her as the hero of the day, ranking 34th out of 35 successful candidates. Unlike the instructor's attitude, the students felt that Irene's actions were foolish. Lance, who often accompanied Bart, was pleased with the results of the day. Thanks to Irene's kindness, he achieved the 5th rank. Everyone gathered around to congratulate him on achieving the 5th rank and receiving a gift from the sword master. Even Bart came over to congratulate him. Lance laughed and thanked Bart for his guidance over the time. The crowd then turned to congratulate Bart, who had secured the 2nd position. Bart, however, was less interested in the congratulations and more focused on Irene. Her performance in this midterm evaluation was at a pace he couldn't keep up with. Bart admitted that if Judith had not exhausted herself, he would probably be at rank 4 by now. The next day, Ilya stopped Irene on the running track and asked why she did it. Irene questioned if she was referring to saving Judith. Ilya repeated her question, asking why she did it. Irene bowed her head and replied that she just felt it was necessary. Ilya loudly stated that it made no sense. Even if Irene hadn't acted, one of the instructors in charge of the phase would have saved her. Ilya angrily continued to question how Irene could give up a reward from one of the best sword masters in the kingdom for such a reason. Furthermore, the mocking mouths and disdainful looks that had been targeting her would continue. Ilya asked if Irene was aware of that, to which Irene countered by asking if Ilya was inquiring whether she knew she was called a lazy noble. Irene had felt for a long time that she was stuck in a quagmire. There was a reason, but it had been so long since she bothered trying to escape from that quagmire. And Irene, as terrible as that, had been loved and pulled out of the mire by her family, and she had managed to stand up thanks to the help of countless people. She couldn't think that pretending not to see someone drowning right in front of her was right. That was also the reason why Irene abandoned her own test to save Judith. Suddenly, Ilya asked Irene if she had said that she had never held a sword until last year. Upon hearing Irene's confirmation, Ilya continued, saying that physical training and sword practice are very different. Both require diligence and skill, but skill is more important when it comes to sword fighting. Irene had indeed missed the opportunity to be directly taught by one of the best sword masters due to the results of yesterday's evaluation. Ilya declared that from now on, she would not help her anymore. Even though Irene might become the laughingstock of everyone, Ilya hoped she would not feel regretful. Irene watched Ilya walk away and asked why she had helped her. Ilya honestly replied that she didn't know, perhaps because she hated the whispers about others. The results of the midterm evaluation were announced. There were 35 candidates who passed the first round of evaluation and 78 who passed the second round. The number of successful candidates was 33. As previously mentioned, the top 5 reserve students from the first round of evaluation would receive a reward after a private meeting with the sword master. After announcing the top 5, Irene was unexpectedly called to the stage. The sword master said that the competition was fascinating because each student was chasing someone else and then had to struggle with the hope of not being overtaken. Irene commended the amazing achievements they had made. He continued to say that if everyone focused too much on it and could not decipher what was around them, they would miss the important things right before their eyes. Irene praised Irene for not doing so. She had sacrificed herself in a situation where she could have fallen into a deep abyss, and because of that, Irene was able to save her drowning friend. People might think differently, but for the sword master and the instructors, this was an action worthy of praise. That was also why Irene was called to the stage. It was Bart's turn to receive his reward and meet the sword master privately. In the sword master's room, Bart for the first time recognized his narrow-minded thoughts and admitted his fault. Irene told Bart that he didn't need to belittle himself like that. A narrow-minded person wouldn't immediately admit their mistakes. After the sword master finished speaking, Bart replied with a no, insisting that he had always done things his way. It was similar to what the sword master had said, but from now on, Bart promised to change and to learn more from others. Irene considered Bart talented and very aware of the situation. He showed a positive commitment to addressing his shortcomings. Bart even had the potential to lead those around him. Bart's standing had an arrogance and pride typical of a high-status noble, which was not bad. The sword master thought if it had been another year, Bart would have been in first place. Unfortunately, this year had too much talent. When it was Ilya's turn, the sword master advised her not to be unstable but to live her life. She shouldn't waste time here only to be bound by her own obsessions. He wished for her to return to her family and learn in her own way, as it would be more beneficial. The last one called to the sword master's room was Irene. He wanted to know what reward she desired. Even if it wasn't something material, it didn't matter, she just needed to speak up. Irene was very eager to hear Irene's response. Surprisingly, when given such a great opportunity, Irene simply asked softly how to reconcile with someone. Irene knew she had made a very unreasonable request. She sincerely apologized to the sword master, but she really had no one else to discuss this matter with. Irene smiled and told her there was no need to apologize, being honest was not wrong at all. He sympathized with Irene, knowing this kid had never left home before the age of 15. This was also her first time being exposed to the outside world, which was why Irene felt bewildered. Irene knew someone needed to reach out and help her. a kid always ridiculed by others. He wanted to know what had happened to Irene. After listening to her story and giving advice, they both were very happy, as it had been a long time since he had to give advice not related to swords. Ian was also surprised that Ilya turned out to be the one to befriend Irene, proving that there were many things even he couldn't understand. Ian set aside this matter and wanted Irene to talk about the main purpose of today's meeting. Ian's conscience wouldn't allow him to just reward Irene with a few words. He permitted her to ask another question about swords. Irene continued to apologize to the swordmaster because she really didn't know what to ask. Frankly, she had only started learning about swords about a month before enrolling here. Irene felt embarrassed as she knew nothing at all, nor did she know what she really wanted. Ian laughed heartily, asking why she felt the need to apologize for such a thing. He wanted Irene to stop apologizing so frequently. As a swordsman, one must know how to stand up strong. The swordmaster decided to defer granting her reward to another time. Ian instructed that whenever Irene felt there was something she didn't understand, she should come to him. Otherwise, he would decide himself what he thought was necessary to teach her. Irene left and Ian thought this child was quite interesting, but he had a feeling that Irene was like someone else. Although Irene knew nothing about swordsmanship and showed no worry or fear, it seemed as if she had a goal set from the beginning. More precisely, Ian felt that Irene was receiving support from someone. Looking at Irene made the swordmaster think of a kid he had met before, a natural talent with overwhelming confidence and an unpredictable personality. However, the energy emitted by the two was not the same. After returning from the swordmaster's room, Irene continued practicing. Judith approached her, saying that they would practice with swords the next day. Irene looked puzzled at Judith. Wasn't this common knowledge? Judith, embarrassed, blurted out that she had something to say. Then, gathering all her courage, she thanked Irene. She assured her that she would definitely repay this debt, so Irene shouldn't worry, and from now on they should train together. Irene looked wide-eyed at Judith. Judith repeated again that from now on they should train together. Since Irene always ate alone, they should start eating together too. Seeing Irene not responding, Judith angrily yelled for an answer. Receiving a confirmation, Judith left without further disturbing Irene's practice. In recent days, everyone had noticed a change in Judith. From a girl who was always abrupt with everyone, she could now converse cheerfully with Irene. Some even speculated that she had become this way because of the near-drowning experience. However, what Bart was most concerned about at the moment was that Irene and Ilya seemed to have a distance between them that he could not understand, wondering what had happened. The sword training session was incredibly enjoyable for the group of students. Judith tested her arm strength with a sword, finding that maintaining balance was easier now than before. Karaka smiled, thinking that of course it wasn't just about improving physical strength. Bart, also pleased, held a wooden sword, noting that it felt very different compared to before. At that moment, everyone's attention turned to Irene to see her choice. To the class's astonishment, Irene picked up a large sword. Karaka noticed that her movements were still rudimentary, but her stance was nearly perfect. Lance contemptuously thought that she was just a newcomer trying to look cool, clearly foolish. Bart pushed through the crowd to stand in front of Irene, issuing a challenge to her. The instructor, clearly displeased, loudly asked the two what they were doing. The class had only just started and yet they were already eager for a duel. Karaka didn't understand why Bart wanted to compete with Irene. Irene had merely swung a sword and hadn't claimed to be skilled with it. The swordmaster laughed, stating that everything has its order, but sometimes exceptions should be made. Ian declared before the match began that if either participant encountered danger during the duel, the instructors would intervene. As the match commenced, Irene consistently dodged Bart's attacks. Those who had previously underestimated Irene thought the match would end quickly, but it appeared Irene was holding up quite well. From a distance, Judith watched angrily, aware that Bart was intentionally testing Irene. Bart noted that Irene's speed wasn't too bad, but he couldn't maintain balance while using the sword. His stance and movements were also quite poor. Bart questioned whether Irene really liked swordsmanship, commenting that he was much worse than he had thought. Bart won the match. Afterwards, Karaka stepped forward to announce the final agenda for the day. Based on the swordsmanship test, the classes would be divided into levels starting the next day. In Class A were Ilya, Bart, and Judith. The instructor reminded the three that being at the top meant training would be harder and that they should be mentally prepared. The classes were assigned, but Irene's name was not included. Ultimately, he was placed in Class F by himself. After leaving the class, Judith remained extremely angry, questioning what Bart was trying to prove. She told Irene not to be too upset, as they still had a chance to defeat him in the final evaluation. Irene, stopping his sword practice to look at Judith, asked her not to be angry anymore. He was happy that she cared, but her anger only bothered him. Judith denied being worried. Bart, returning to his room to rest, couldn't forget the final image from their duel. It wasn't just the swordsmanship. Irene's unusual gaze and gestures had also made a strong impression. Bart felt there was something very determined and powerful about him, and wondered what his own facial expression was like during their combat. The next day, Irene went to Class F alone, where Run Tarhal greeted him. Run asked if Irene knew nothing but slashing vertically, to which Irene apologetically nodded. Run smiled warmly, telling him there was no need to apologize as one couldn't improve without proper training. However, Run needed to know what Irene possessed to keep up with those who had started sword training early. Irene skeptically replied that hard training was his method. Run corrected him, saying that what he actually had was talent. While hard training was crucial, it depended on how much one practiced. Run continued, saying that others could be equal to or stronger than the person they pursued, but this didn't apply to Irene due to the significant difference in training time. Run set a goal for Irene to master the basic skills of swordsmanship within a week. If he succeeded, he would be promoted directly to Class C. If he failed, nothing would change, and he would continue training in Class F. Run approached and placed a hand on Irene's shoulder, stating that if he didn't have talent, it would be best to leave the academy. Irene firmly responded that he would try his hardest. Run praised him, confident that he would train diligently. On the second day, Run stayed by Irene's side, coaching each small movement and how to rotate his body correctly, using just the right amount of force. By the sixth day, Irene continuously received praise from his instructor. Run thought that the improvement pace of the young man was truly impressive, noting that he hadn't been as good at that stage himself. Irene was truly different from his outward appearance. Run could only exclaim that Irene indeed had talent for swordsmanship. On the last day in Class F, Irene asked Judith to review his movements for the test the following day. Unlike her usual scolding, today Irene received recognition from her. After all his efforts, Irene was finally moved up to Class C. Previously, Judith had suggested they eat together, and she truly kept her promise. During the meal, she constantly urged Irene to eat more, emphasizing the importance of proper nutrition. She complained that someone who ate as little as he did could not possibly move quickly. Lance passed by their table, joking that it seemed like there was a hippopotamus in the class. Judith, annoyed, turned around and asked if he liked her. Lance, irritated, asked what she was talking about. Bart, more composed, told them to stop it and to refrain from speaking ill of others, noting that it was unbecoming. Judith laughed loudly as the group walked away, remarking that those mischievous ones had finally been tamed. Meanwhile, Ilya passed by their table without intending to stop. Judith curiously asked Irene why the two seemed cold towards each other. Irene was about to deny it, but softly asked Judith back if their behavior could be considered arguing. From Judith, he learned that Ilya hadn't changed. She was still the top student in Class A. The instructor also recognized her as a rare genius. However, perhaps feeling intimidated, no one dared to initiate conversation with Ilya. Judith also knew that Ilya had gone to the Soyeon weapon depot alone late at night to train in sensing the swordsmanship of her family. Judith dangerously smiled, urging Irene to quickly move up the ranks so he could train there with her. After their meal, the two continued their training together. As Irene had thought, when Judith focused on the match, it was tough for him to withstand her attacks. She was indeed at a completely different level. Judith won the match, laughing and praising Irene for his rapid progress, though he still hadn't reached her level. Judith decided to end the training session there, as they were the only two left on the field. Before leaving, she reminded Irene that if he wanted to meet Ilya, he should go to the Soyeon weapon depot. Despite saying he wouldn't go, Irene soon found himself at the weapon depot. He brought a letter and a gift to meet Ilya. She, puzzled, asked why he brought those things. Irene whispered that he had a younger sister who was not good at communicating with others. Due to frequent misunderstandings, they often argued. However, the next day, she would leave a letter beside Irene's bed. He admitted he wasn't good at explaining things either. Organizing words in a sensible way and saying them was even harder, so he decided to write a letter, hoping it would be easier to understand. Irene now realized why his sister often wrote letters, because some things are really hard to say. Ilya, in return, asked Irene if he thought she would continue to help him just because of these things. Irene turned away and apologized for bothering her while she was training, though he said that when Ilya returned to her room, she still took out the letter to read. The next morning, Judith began training with Irene again, intending to increase the intensity. Irene timidly asked if she could go easier on him. Just then, Bart approached them. Judith, surprised, asked if the blue-haired guy wanted to fight. Bart, not angry but calm, told them he wanted to train with them. Bart looked at Irene, referring to his performance in the midterm evaluation and during the match. Bart acknowledged that Irene possessed a level of focus that he lacked. He expressed a desire for Irene to teach him how to achieve that focus, and in exchange, he would teach Irene how to properly use a sword. Bart loudly proclaimed that he would be pleased if the two perform a team for a short period and grow together. Judith asked Bart what he intended to do. Approaching him, she inquired about his plans following the assessment of Irene's abilities in their duel. Judith suspected that Bart wanted to use Irene to gain some personal advantage. Bart countered, questioning what was wrong with that idea. He explained that he could devise his own methods to become stronger, but those methods were ineffective here. Bart argued that not only he but everyone could benefit from his plan. He pointed out that, apart from class time, Judith herself trained all day with Irene. He believed that gaining experience from facing various people was essential. Bart urged Judith to think bigger about swordsmanship, emphasizing that their learning shouldn't be confined to just this place as it presented an opportunity for everyone to learn and compete fiercely with each other. People around them did not understand what had gotten into Bart, an A-class student saying such things to a C-class peer. Irene, not intending to refuse, wanted to confirm if Bart was really okay with that. Aware of her capabilities, Irene felt she had nothing to teach him. Bart laughed, mentioning he had already said she possessed something he lacked. He had been contemplating a lot since the midterm evaluation. What exactly did Irene have that he, despite his training, could not achieve? He wanted to discover what made Irene different. Bart had considered that everyone had the same amount of training time, but the intensity of their engagement varied significantly. Since the beginning of the training session until its end, Irene never lost her focus. At that moment, Bart finally asked Irene how she managed to maintain such concentration. Irene wanted to help but genuinely didn't know why. Bart didn't blame her but responded that he knew she would say that, as geniuses always do. From what he observed, Bart concluded that Irene must be a genius. Maintaining focus was not something easily achievable. Bart left as he had another training session later that day and reminded them that he would train with both of them the next day. Judith loudly questioned when she had agreed to train with him. Bart paused, giving Irene one more piece of advice to stop belittling herself with her own words. Bart was born into the Pereira family, a lineage of nobility, something he hadn't known before, but now the way he acted and his capabilities suggested noble qualities. Thus, he should carry himself with pride and dignity. Judith, covering her mouth, asked if anyone else felt nauseous hearing such words. She criticized Bart for always meddling in others' affairs, yet being able to speak such lofty words. The next day, Bart genuinely went to the training field to meet Irene, patiently pointing out her mistakes. Although Bart initiated the conversation, Judith consistently refused to spar with him. Bart turned to ask Irene how long she thought it would take for Judith to agree to train with him. Irene laughed loudly, replying that it would probably take a week since Judith doesn't swear. During a meal that day, Ilya passed by and casually mentioned to Irene that she had read the letter. Judith, overhearing this, curiously asked if Irene had confessed her feelings, to which Irene responded in shock, denying it. Later that night, as Irene lay in bed, she continued to ponder the words Bart had said about focus. She questioned herself on how she could improve her concentration to be like the man of her dreams. In her dream that night, Irene felt a completely different sensation from her hand. Not just her arm, but her entire body sensed the presence of that man. Waking up before dawn, Irene felt compelled to practice her swordsmanship before the feeling faded. Over the following days, Irene consistently appeared exhausted, even lying down with her eyes closed on a bench in the training room. Judith wanted to approach and call out to her, but Bart stopped her, suggesting they let her rest as she seemed very tired. However, Irene surprised them by suddenly getting up to practice her swordsmanship and then lying back down. At this point, Bart approached Irene. He apologized for disturbing her, but was curious about what she was doing. Irene shyly replied that she was practicing to improve her focus, and this method seemed effective. Bart, intrigued, continued to ask if it was meditation, commenting that it was how priests found their true selves. Bart climbed onto a nearby chair and lay down to try it himself. He found it not as bad as he thought, which helped him calm down gradually. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Lance's face asking if he was sleeping. Bart confidently responded that he was just meditating. Judith laughed loudly, pointing out his drooling state while supposedly meditating. Bart switched to a sitting posture and began meditating. Judith approached and scolded him, calling him a fool, saying that this method would not work for him as Irene was an exceptional case. Bart did not give up and replied that he wouldn't know unless he tried. Judith walked away, no longer interested. After a while, the swordmaster received information that Irene had been promoted to Class B. Karaka mentioned that thanks to the guidance of both Judith and Bart, Irene's progress had been rapid. He also noted that, as Ian had predicted in class, Irene was the one creating a ripple effect. Now many were beginning to adopt her method of meditation. Judith did not expect that one day Bart would outdo her in a duel. Although the two argued continuously, their competition pleased their instructor immensely. Thanks to this rivalry, both advanced at an exceptionally fast pace, particularly Bart, who had a slight edge over Judith as they vied for rankings. Bart was quietly thrilled that his meditation practice was finally yielding results. He believed that if he continued at this rate, he could even catch up to Ilya. On the other side, Irene also felt the benefits of meditation, but felt it still wasn't enough and needed something more. After class, Bart and Judith quickly went to find Irene outside in the forest. From a distance, Bart asked why she was always practicing vertical cuts. He then informed her that the sword mastery master was calling everyone to gather quickly. Irene, stopping for a moment, asked if they were gathering in the meeting room, but strangely, today's gathering place was the martial arts arena. Ian waited for everyone to assemble and then spoke, telling them that they had been here for 9 months now. Throughout their training, they had endured strict evaluations and intense training. Many had progressed significantly since their first day. He got straight to the point about the final evaluation, which was different from the midterm that was based on skills at a fixed point in time. The final evaluation was a bit abstract as it was meant to assess the potential at each individual. Irene looked around and continued, saying there was no need to worry as this would not pose a difficulty for anyone. They simply needed to demonstrate what they were capable of and what they excelled at in swordsmanship. On this occasion, the sword master also prepared a small gift for the trainees. Holding a sword, Ian stepped forward, explaining that he was just an old man practicing with his swords, and he hoped they could learn something from it. Everyone was still in awe and disbelief after the sword master's demonstration. Returning to their practice, Bart asked Judith if she found the sword master's technique truly astonishing. Receiving no response, Bart expressed his frustration, comparing talking to her to talking to a wall. Suddenly, Judith shouted at Bart to be quiet, wondering why he was always so noisy. Bart, undeterred, inquired if she was in a bad mood, presuming it was because of her worry for Irene, who had been focusing on meditation despite the upcoming final evaluation. Bart speculated about Irene's condition but answered his own question confidently, believing Irene would pass the test. Judith questioned how Bart could be so sure. Ignoring her displeased expression, Bart asked what the critical criterion of the final test was. He explained that it was about potential, as the sword master had mentioned, not the current ability but the potential for future capabilities. He pointed out that anyone joining the academy had great potential, but the most developed over the past months was none other than Irene. Bart encouraged her, instead of sitting there worrying about Irene, to continue practicing herself. Judith, regaining her smile, declared she would reach the top position. Bart dismissed this, arguing that it was impossible as Ilya would be the top, coming from the most prestigious Lindsay family on the continent, known as one of the most esteemed in swordsmanship. Therefore, no one could take the top rank from Ilya. Judith disagreed, arguing that being from a prominent family shouldn't guarantee the top rank. Bart nonchalantly replied he was just stating the obvious. The prowess in their sword style was formidable. Judith, growing angry again, demanded Bart take things seriously. If he already knew the outcome, why even participate in the exam? She loudly criticized the Lindsay family as nothing special, mentioning her brother, considered the best genius in the continent, was defeated by an ordinary orphan who now avoided confrontations. Suddenly, Ilya appeared from behind. She stated it wouldn't be a problem if Judith cursed or underestimated her family. Despite others speaking ill of her behind her back, Ilya claimed she was unaffected. Judith, unwilling to back down, loudly challenged Ilya to a duel. Bart intervened, stepping forward to prevent any foolish actions, reminding everyone that fighting among students would lead to expulsion. Ilya left, declaring she would secure the top position this time and continue to do so in the future. She expressed that she didn't need to rely on her family's sword style, as what she learned at the academy was enough to surpass them all in skill. Bart approached Ilya to stop her from leaving and asked if the Cloud Sword was the style of the Lindsay family. He continued, questioning if the name was given by the Dragon King of Demons, who ruled the skies 400 years ago. Ilya, puzzled, looked at Bart. Bart smiled, revealing that he wanted to see firsthand how exceptional it was. Ilya turned away, stating that would never happen. Irene continues to train diligently with the sword but cannot recapture the feeling experienced in the dream. Irene keeps thinking that they are getting closer, but now it feels like the distance is only growing. Once again, Irene tries to focus by meditating while holding the sword. Recently, Judith and Bart have been training together more frequently. Bart is becoming faster. Judith notices that he is not only sharper but also stronger than before. Now she even doubts whether Bart could surpass Ilya and take the top spot. Judith has to admit that with her current abilities, she stands no chance against him. However, Bart has taught her that there is no need to rush to achieve longer-term goals. Thus, she feels more confident about defeating Bart once they become official students. Today, Bart decides to stop training earlier, feeling that it's best not to overdo it before the exam. Judith rarely agrees with Bart's views. He laughs loudly, asking if she ate something odd today because she isn't getting angry. Judith replies that she has things to do. Meanwhile, Irene, despite trying various training positions, doesn't notice any difference. Irene is truly at a loss for clues to recreate the feeling from the dream. Judith approaches and asks if Irene feels stifled, suggesting they go outside to get some fresh air. They sit in the grassy area behind the academy. Judith asks how Irene is preparing for the evaluation test. Irene says they are just doing their best. Irene asks Judith if she feels confident, to which Judith, opening one eye, replies affirmatively, stating she will do her utmost. She suggests Irene should ask Ilya if he feels confident about winning. Suddenly, Judith apologizes to Irene for not being able to train with them for a long time. Initially, when they sparred, she taught Irene some new moves. Irene smiles, saying they are fine and Judith shouldn't feel guilty. Out of the blue, Judith shares that she is an orphan. As a child, Judith had to struggle every day, stealing and snatching food from stores. She noticed that everyone around her did the same regardless of age. Living this way, Judith never felt grateful to anyone or for anything she received. This is also why she was angry about being saved by Irene instead of expressing gratitude. Judith actually finds it quite cheesy to talk about it. Therefore, she tried to repay Irene in her own way, but it turned out to be less effective than she thought. Judith loudly tells Irene that they must perform well, especially in this final evaluation. Once they become official students, she can help Irene more and also feel less uncomfortable. After finishing her words, Judith stands up, ready to leave. She mentions that if they leave together now, it would be awkward for her, so she asks Irene to wait another 5 minutes after she leaves. Irene silently thinks that the person who did not meet anyone by their side for the past 2 months was themselves. It seems they have really changed a lot. Previously, they only knew how to lay in bed, but now they can enjoy the sky every day. A year at the academy has not been bad at all. Irene feels like they now understand themselves better and is truly grateful for everything. Judith, Bart, Ilya, the swordsmanship master, and the instructor. It's time for Irene to give back all that they have learned. The final evaluation test has started. The instructor, standing next to swordsman Irene, informs him that among the lower-ranked trainees, many are progressing rapidly. Perhaps the rankings will change today. Lance on the field performs a slashing move on a stone. Although it's a diagonal cut and not a vertical one, the cut is very clean. The swordsman thinks everyone has exceeded expectations, and he feels a bit disappointed. The next to perform the test is Judith. She asks the master if she can participate in the evaluation with another potential trainee. The instructor asks Judith if she understands what she is asking. Undeterred, Judith replies that she believes through combat they can better showcase each other's strengths. Moreover, it's good for the apprentices to train together. The swordsman interrupts, finding the idea intriguing. He wants to know who will pair with Judith today. Today, Judith's partner is Bart. Judith looks at her opponent and says she wanted to relax today, but obviously that won't be possible. Today she must win. Bart smiles and accepts, saying if she is capable enough, Judith. The duel between the two keeps all the students engrossed. Run Tarhal comments that both are excellent. Judith has an extremely ambitious sword technique, but Bart is no ordinary opponent. He deftly avoided the attacking sword strikes as if they were nothing. Judith angrily curses Bart. He laughs, asking if that's all she has to offer in her quest for victory. Despite her best efforts and quicker sword movements, she ultimately fails to defeat him. The instructors laugh heartily, noting that the match was evenly matched, but Bart still had the upper hand. The sword master praises the duel as excellent, acknowledging the hard effort from both. He then expresses eagerness to see who will perform next. Ilya steps forward, confident that he has become significantly stronger and might even defeat Bart. Judith informs the sword master that she will use the family sword, the celestial sword that slew the Dragon King. After feeling the breeze from the sword, everyone is dazzled by the light it emits. Judith, witnessing such powerful swordsmanship for the first time, murmurs asking what that is. Karaka, standing beside her, responds that it's the celestial sword. Bart, incredulous, can't believe that the celestial sword truly exists. It forms a high wall that he cannot breach to reach Ilya. The final turn is Irene's. Judith, standing below, cheers loudly for Irene. As Irene approaches the stage, Bart beneath feels uneasy. He recalls their previous conversation where Irene called him a good person, saying they felt very comfortable around him, which might also be why others like working with him. Bart, puzzled, asks why they would casually say that. Irene just responds that they probably made a mistake again. At this moment, Bart looks at Irene on the platform and thinks to himself that he is not as good as Irene thinks. Irene is nothing special. The sword master, seeing Irene approaching, laughs loudly, asking what they want to show him. In response to everyone's astonishment, Irene declares they will perform a vertical slash. Lance stands up and loudly scolds them, reminding them that this is the final evaluation and critical techniques are still lacking, let alone a vertical slash. The instructor loudly warns Lance that if he interferes with the evaluation again, he will be expelled. Though he says this, he believes everyone present shares Lance's thoughts. He doubts whether Irene is trying to demonstrate extraordinary techniques like a vertical slash at this crucial arena. He genuinely wants to know what Irene is thinking. The sword master accepts, eager to see despite not having trained them. Irene was not even interested in the swordsmanship their master would produce. They began the process of meditation, entering into their subconscious. Although they didn't know who the man was or what he wanted to cut, in that moment of pain and endurance he kept swinging his sword, moving forward with indomitable will. Irene gradually felt this emotion, projecting it through a powerful slash that cracked the arena floor wide open. Without making the students wait, the sword master announced the results immediately after all the contestants had finished. Judith ranked 4th, followed by Bart, with Irene securing the 2nd place and Ilya coming in 1st. He added that everyone had worked hard for the evaluation and would inform them later about the next interview session, so everyone could now go rest. Ilya sought out Irene at the training grounds. As she had guessed, Irene was the only one who had immediately headed to the field after the test ended. Ilya sincerely complimented Irene on having grown much stronger. Bart and Judith were also not far behind. However, it had been a long time since she felt someone catching up to her. Irene had nearly won 1st place, and typically she should have been angry, but this time she found it intriguing. At that moment, Irene's swordplay was truly powerful and threatening to others. Irene responded by praising Ilya's celestial sword as well. Ilya laughed loudly, appreciating the compliment since Irene was not usually one to give praise. After a pause, Ilya revealed that she would not be staying at the Chrono Academy. In fact, from the beginning, she had not intended to become an official sword student. Ilya only wanted to secure the top position in the midterm and final evaluations and then return to her family immediately. She disclosed that the most talented person on the continent was actually Carl Lindsay, her older brother. When Ilya was 6 years old, there was nobody on the continent who hadn't heard of Carl Lindsay. He became famous after battles with knights. With his extraordinary talent, he reached heights that his peers could not. Carl was recognized by many renowned figures and quickly became known as the supreme prodigy. The weight of countless expectations from others bore down on him. Although just a commoner, he secured the highest position at the Chrono Swordsmanship Academy, but declined to become an official student. Then, at the age of 14, the continent's second prodigy named Irene, who founded a group of mercenaries, challenged Carl to a duel. Following his family's tradition of not backing down from tough battles, he accepted the challenge. The duel ended with Irene's victory after 3 strikes, and the image of the brother she had always idolized began to crumble for Ilya. She could not believe her eyes and ran to embrace him. Carl comforted his sister as if nothing had happened. Ilya believed that her brother would overcome the challenge and eventually win. However, Carl could not recover. Since then, he has always had to face cold stares and fell into utter despair. After receiving immense pressure from criticisms and mockery, Carl collapsed while still young. Ilya knew that people's prejudices were what confined her brother to his room. Ilya wanted to decide her own life and not be controlled by anyone, but before she realized it, she was already being controlled. The reason Ilya entered the academy at age 12 was because Irene had become top-ranked after joining the academy at age 13. Ilya wanted to be recognized by the Royal Knights at age 14 since Irene was knighted as an honorary knight at age 15. But now Ilya was tired of chasing after someone. Ilya secretly thought it was all thanks to Irene, who had never been controlled by anyone and had always followed his own path. So Ilya also made a new resolve to follow her heart's call. She knew she could reach the realm of a master if she pursued her own path. Irene acknowledged that Ilya was very wonderful. She had overcome many difficulties and was aiming for a world far beyond the academy. A person like him never had a clear goal. Ilya laughed and told Irene not to be so careless. She added that he should train harder, otherwise she would surpass him in no time. Irene, holding his sword, wondered if he was really okay. After the competition ended, Bart didn't leave but stayed to look at the marks Irene had made. Judith noticed something was wrong and approached him, stating that the area was planned for reconstruction and was off limits. She then challenged him to go outside and fight a few rounds. Bart surprisingly declared that he gave up, realizing that someone who had just picked up a sword could harness so much power after only 1 year of training, whereas he had been training for many years. Bart wondered how long it would take for him to reach that level, or if he would ever achieve it, feeling as if only the chosen could succeed. Judith, unable to hold back, pulled Bart and punched him hard, scolding him for not being able to dodge her punch after dodging all her sword attacks. She continued to berate him, asking if his body had turned to stone after his brain. Judith questioned him about what it means to be chosen, saying that if she can't beat him, does it mean she's worthless? She angrily asked Bart if all the swordsmanship students here were wasting their lives. Judith loudly told him to be proud of it, proud to have defeated the continent's top genius in a battle while still young, and that should be enough to brag for the rest of his life. He was ready to give up after facing a little adversity. A few days later, interviews continued at the swordsmanship room. Irene asked Ilya if she was currently satisfied with what she had achieved, not because she reached the top rank. The swordmaster laughed heartily, noting that she looked more radiant than before. Next was Bart, and the swordmaster was very surprised when he heard his decision. He said Bart's swordsmanship was wonderful enough to be a model for others, and he had high expectations for this student. Bart bowed and apologized, admitting he had lost confidence in himself. His eyes were like flickering candles. The master hoped there would be an opportunity to soothe this child's emotions. It was Irene's turn for an assessment that became the most memorable for the swordmaster. He honestly admitted that in his many years as a swordmaster, this was the first time he had been so surprised. The swordmaster had a question for Irene. What was the reason he wielded the sword? Irene had never been able to figure out why he wanted to wield the sword. Misunderstanding his worry, the instructor encouraged him, saying it didn't have to be a noble reason. Even mundane ones like fame or money were acceptable as long as they didn't contradict morality. After a while, the swordmaster no longer needed Irene's answer. He knew Irene practiced swordsmanship, not out of personal will. Irene found it very strange. Irene progressed faster and trained harder than anyone else. If such progress was made, emotions should change, but Irene had no emotions. Bart had been joyful when he felt his abilities improve. Judith was frightened when she fell behind. All the apprentice swordsmen showed emotions, happy or sad, with their swords. However, the master saw no emotion in Irene. Ian looked straight into Irene's eyes and asked if he was practicing swordsmanship following someone else. Irene, not hiding it, admitted this was true. Ian whispered that indeed it was so. It was surprising that Irene had progressed this much just by following someone else and not out of his own will. The swordmaster didn't inquire further about that person, but he wanted Irene to think seriously about why he uses the sword in the future. If there was no reason to hold a sword, then there was no reason for him to stay here. For it's more important to realize oneself in a vast world than just to wield a sword here. Irene thanked Ian for his advice, promising never to forget it. Ian laughed heartily, saying it should be the last time he made such melancholic remarks. Irene was recognized as the 27th swordsman of the Chrono Swordsmanship Academy. Moreover, the swordmaster gave Irene a year to find his own sword. Before returning home, Ilya gave Irene a token, asking him to visit often. By presenting the token to the gatekeeper, he would be treated well. Furthermore, if he visited, Ilya promised to give Irene flowers. The longevity herb was the flower engraved on her bracelet. At the age of 7, Ilya had pulled them all out, but this time she was determined to replant them. She promised Irene that if he visited at the same time next year, there would definitely be flowers. From a distance, Judith approached, wanting a shiny piece from Ilya's hand. After receiving it, Judith joyfully examined it and remarked that it could definitely be sold for a lot of money. She then turned to Ilya, apologizing for her previous outburst and for insulting Ilya's family, explaining that her reaction stemmed from never having had a family herself. Leaving the two behind, Irene approached Bart to inquire about his rumored departure from the academy. Bart simply replied that it was complicated to explain. Seeing the luggage with Irene, he asked if he was also leaving. Irene cheerfully informed him that it wasn't a permanent departure. He would return after completing a personal training course. Bart thought that unlike his own despondency about stopping, he indeed needed to learn more. Irene then thanked Bart for helping him feel alive when wielding the sword. Irene couldn't specify but mentioned that something had changed inside him over the past year. Because of this change, he began studying swordsmanship and joined the Chrono Swordsmanship Academy. It was only upon meeting Bart that he could look back at his past and move forward. Bart, trembling, boarded the carriage, facing himself and continuously urging himself to be stronger. Judith mockingly commented that the two resembled lovers parting. Subsequently, Irene's servant brought a carriage to take him away. Judith, left behind, thought to herself that she had to stay here waiting for his return. But when exactly would that be? She walked back to the academy alone, ultimately left to herself. Suddenly, Bart ran up from behind, asking what she was staring at on the ground. Judith loudly asked why he had returned. Bart explained that he had thought it through and couldn't give up in such a disheveled state. Moreover, with Irene gone, no one else could tolerate her difficult personality. Provoked, Judith scolded the crazy man for his words. Moreover, she pointed out that the instructors wouldn't accept someone who had already left. Bart, undeterred, naturally replied that he was prepared to beg a lot. After all, they wouldn't give up on a talent like him. The close servant of Irene, noticing that the young master kept looking out the window, misunderstood that his mood was down because he couldn't become an official swordsman. His attention was drawn to the card in Irene's hand only when he realized it was the Platinum Order of the Lindsay clan, and he exclaimed as if it was his last moment alive. Irene explained that the card was a gift from a friend. The servant was surprised because the Lindsay clan is extremely prestigious. As evening approached, they stopped at an inn where Irene, as usual, took the opportunity to meditate during the break. Outside, the servant, hearing no noise from his master, paced back and forth worriedly. He thought Irene seemed very disappointed and that he needed to do something. Out in the streets, the servant unexpectedly encountered a spiritual fortune teller. This individual, normally seen only in the northern part of the continent but now in the south, was not just any spiritual being, as he wore a necklace and had a tattoo. It was indeed the spiritual fortune teller. The servant hurried back to call Irene to the street, informing him that among the fortune tellers, the best was the spiritual one. Irene also heard that meeting a spiritual fortune teller was extremely fortunate. The spiritual fortune teller laughed heartily when they arrived, asking who would have their fortune told. The servant knew that these spiritual fortune tellers were famous for speaking pleasing words. He hoped that the young master would feel better after hearing them. Before telling fortunes, the spiritual fortune teller looked at Irene and asked how old he was. Hearing that the person before him was only 16, the fortune teller was a bit skeptical. But if it was true, he remarked that Irene could join any Medley order and be accepted, especially if pursuing the path of swordsmanship, where he would likely be more successful. Angrily standing behind, the servant asked if he really was a fortune teller, and then spoke those words in front of his young master. The fortune teller called to Irene, handing him a paper saying it would be useful when he encountered something unfavorable. He noted that Irene not only had a robust body but also a very agile muscle density. More importantly, there was a formidable strength surrounding him. Saying he was 16 with that strength was unbelievable. The spiritual fortune teller looked on regretfully, not knowing if they would meet again. The next morning, upon boarding the carriage, the servant apologized for the previous day's incident, not knowing the man was a fraud. Irene remembered the paper from the previous day and took it out to examine it. On the paper, it was written that he did not need to stand alone. Irene, astounded, wondered if the fortune teller asked his age because it related to the man in his dream. Meanwhile, the servant continued to blame the fortune teller for speaking such words to someone who had failed an exam and was on his way back home, claiming that the young master could join any medley order was indeed absurd. Irene couldn't help but laugh, questioning what had he said that he failed the exam. The carriage soon encountered the carriage of Earl Garen. The servant lamented why they had to meet an enemy of the Pereira family in such a place. That family had always looked down on and insulted Irene, and moreover, the person in the carriage was Aaron. The servant turned back to inform Irene that Aaron had alighted from the carriage with Duke Jack Stewart. He intended to suggest that if Irene was uncomfortable, he could stay in the carriage, but Irene had already gotten out on his own. Aaron, upon seeing him, began to reassess Irene, thinking highly of him though still dismissing him as a mere nobody. He asked if Irene was returning from the Chronos Swordsmanship Academy and intentionally remarked if the academy taught well, surprised by Irene's change. He was sure that Irene had been expelled from the academy. Calmly, Irene replied that he was still studying there. Irene asked if Aaron had anything else to say since the journey was long and he wished to continue. Aaron, despite trying to provoke, did not anger Irene, which made him doubt if this was truly a lazy noble. Before leaving, he wanted to shake hands with Irene, knowing that through a handshake, one could ascertain the other's strength. Aaron thought, as a swordsman of 6 years, he wanted to see how Irene's swordsmanship had improved. He then planned to crush Irene's hand with his strength. However, once again disappointing him, Irene showed no sign of pain. Instead, it was he who had to pull his hand back, yelling in pain. Innocently, Irene apologized for not controlling his strength the first time. After Aaron left, a talking cat approached and asked Irene why he didn't fight back. The servant was shocked at the talking cat. Was this a sorcerer transformed into a cat, or was the cat itself a sorcerer? On Aaron's side, there was no intention to linger and eavesdrop. They knew better than to mess with a sorcerer. Jack Stewart stepped forward, bowed, and apologized for the previous disrespectful actions, now asking for permission to leave. If there were any grievances, they were welcome to visit the land of Garen. The cat stood on 2 legs and asked if they were just going to leave like that. Should there at least be a fight? Jack forced a smile, stating that there had been a good understanding between the 2 families, and there must have been some misunderstanding. It wasn't until the carriage had moved on for a while that Irene turned to the servant beside him, asking if the cat was someone transformed. The servant replied that he wasn't sure, but it might be related to Miss Curl, as she was also a sorcerer. They would find out once they returned to the castle. Upon arriving home, Irene was greeted at the gate by a family of 3. His father and aunt were proud upon learning that Irene had been acknowledged for his talent by a master swordsman. Irene had never expected to hear such words from his father. He continued to ask his son if he had heard Marcus say that they had encountered a talking cat on their way back. He informed him that the cat was a sorcerer named Ruru, not a human transformed but intelligent like a human. Curl chimed in that it was super strong, able to tell at a glance that it was stronger than any sorcerer in the capital. Emilia mentioned that Ruru had visited 10 days ago and offered to be Kairo's master. They had gone to the Sorcerers Association to inquire about its identity, but more importantly, they considered Kurl's wishes. Kurl stood up from her chair and asked her brother what he thought. Irene replied that the decision lay with her, as he knew nothing about sorcery. Kurl understood that, but what she needed was her brother's impression of Ruru. Emilia reminded her daughter not to trouble her brother. Kurl retorted, asking what trouble she had caused. Irene thought about it again. Kurl's stubborn nature was showing signs. He really didn't understand why she was so angry. To prevent the argument from escalating, Irene brought out gifts he had prepared for the family. His parents were surprised and hadn't expected Irene to think of gifts. Irene silently thanked Marcus for saving him once again. These gifts were also suggested by him. Suddenly, Ruru appeared, saying it was no wonder the scents were similar, but the 2 didn't look alike at all. Since Ruru was already there and wanted to try persuading Irene, Kurl angrily asked what it was rambling about. She demanded a clear explanation. Ruru candidly replied that the brother seemed easier to persuade than she was. Moreover, since Kurl loved her brother so much, if it could persuade him, she would likely follow suit. Seeing Kurl's angry face, Ruru questioned if it shouldn't have spoken like that. Angrily, she stormed off, declaring she would never become its disciple. Back in his room, Irene reflected on how just a single gift had made his parents so happy. Their reaction was even more emotional than when he was accepted into the academy. To regular families, such a thing might seem trivial, but seeing his parents happy over the little things made him feel both happy and sad. Irene resolved not to waste time as he had before. He could not delay finding his ideal in swordsmanship. Meanwhile, Earl Philgara noticed his son Jack's troubled demeanor upon returning from the Pereiras and called him to ask what had happened. Jack recounted their encounter with Irene on the way back and how he had changed significantly since returning from the Chrono Academy, which infuriated Phil. Phil disparaged the academy, claiming it was nothing compared to the Sorcery Institute. Phil genuinely disliked the Pereira family, a beautiful lady with a dignified appearance and a daughter who knew sorcery. The land of Pereira was also becoming more prosperous. The only weak point was Irene, but now he had grown stronger too. Phil cursed, wishing Irene had stayed confined to his room instead of coming out. Ran, Phil's son, spoke up, suggesting that if it was just a budding shoot, it should be crushed easily. There would soon be a gathering in Pereira, with the heads of 6 prestigious families present. He suggested they crush that useless young master again. Phil agreed and instructed his eldest son to prepare for the journey.